1. I'm a 19-year-old, 130 pounds shy female. I suffer from anxiety, hence I get spooked pretty easily. And being an international student takes a toll on you, as there really isn't anyone you can fully rely on. This happened to me a week ago. I was moving out of the house my ex-boyfriend and I used to share. I had one bag left, and I went to collect it from our old flat. It's in the part of Glasgow in the UK that you can't find taxis easily. I prefer black cabs, but I felt lucky when I was able to get an Uber. So I placed my bag in the trunk and get in. Turns out it was someone me and my ex had used before. Being from the same country and being in his cab before, I felt a bit easy and answered his questions honestly. Big mistake. He started asking me about my boyfriend, on which I told him we broke up. I know, big mistake. The guy took that as a cue to start flirting. Me, being the shy idiot I was, politely declined. He was as old as my father, but persistent in trying to ask me out and hang out with me. It came to a point that I realized he was taking an abnormally longer route than usual. I opened the app and realized he had ended the ride on his app, and we were nowhere near my place. He kept on talking, but I froze in fear, my mind going into overdrive. But the worst part was he started shouting his number and asked me to call him right that moment. He was very demanding with his request, and honestly I was on the verge of tears. In my panic haze, I remembered my new flatmate would be home. I took a screenshot of his name and license plate from my Uber app and sent it to her, along with my location, and immediately called her and very loudly told her, "This is the Uber I'm riding and my location." The cab driver, registering the fact that just because I was friendly and shy didn't give him the chance of taking advantage of me, turned back and started going back the right route. I stayed on call with my flatmate till I reached home, where she was waiting for me outside the door. He snarled at me to get out and sped off. I was just lucky that nothing happened and honestly just put off by Ubers. I reported him and deleted my Uber app. So to the driver who tried to take advantage of me, let's not meet. 2. Please be aware the following story contains themes of sexual assault. The fall of 2014 brought about a lot of changes in my life. My older sister had moved away to college. I started my junior year at a new high school. But the biggest event happened one October night at a party. My parents' friends were having a bit of a birthday bash for Mr. Dale. Mr. Dale and Mrs. Amy are best friends with my parents, so there was no way on earth that my parents were going to miss out on this party. I was 16 at the time, so my parents used me as a DD. Besides, 2 other teenagers would be there, so I wouldn't be alone in that regard. As we pulled up to Mrs. Amy and Mr. Dale's house, the sun was casting its last grey rays of light. I helped my father carry 2 boxes full of beer and assorted liquor through the woods, behind the house to a clearing next to a pond. In the clearing were several of my parents' friends, standing around a large campfire. We were quickly greeted by a mountain of a man with a sizable beard. "Dale!" my father exclaimed, as he shoved the box full of liquor into the large man's hands. Just about that time, a man I had never met before came through a break in the trees. I shrugged him off as one of Mr. Dale's friends or family members that my father didn't know. I set the case of beer down on a table, cluttered with all kinds of bottles of alcohol, and took a seat in the old sack chair next to the fire. A few moments later, I was joined by 2 boys, Jared and Turner. These were kids of other partygoers who were about my age. I had met them many times before in a similar environment. After a few minutes of small talk, we were silenced by an ear-splitting whistle from my father. That was the call to supper. As everyone filed their way through the woods back to the house, my father and Mr. Dale stopped me. "Did you see the man a few steps ahead of us in the red cap?" my father asked. I noticed he was gesturing to the strange man I had seen earlier. I nodded. "His name is Tom, and he has bad news. He wasn't supposed to be here, but he is. I don't want you to talk to him. If he speaks to you, come and tell me or Dale, whoever is closer." I nodded again, understanding that my usually cheery father was very serious in that moment. Supper passed uneventfully. We three teens chatted away at the kitchen table, even after supper was well over and most guests had wandered back to the clearing. Jared was recounting a hilarious story about his last fishing trip when Tom came into the kitchen. I observed him as he began to rummage through the food that was left out on the counter. Tom was in his early to mid-40s like my father, and just about everyone else there. He was incredibly average looking, although a bit dirty. The t-shirt he wore was dingy from wear, and his sweat-stained baseball cap had faded to a gaudy pink. As Tom turned to leave, we met eyes. He smiled an unfriendly smile that oozed bad intentions as he stepped out of the kitchen and rejoined the celebration. Neither of the boys seemed to notice the exchange. I pushed Tom out of my mind and tuned back into Jared's story. Eventually, Jared and Turner headed home with their respective inebriated parents in tow. This left me, the only person under 30 at the gathering. Soon thereafter, I began to feel sick and informed my mother of my nausea. Mrs. Amy offered to let me sleep it off in her daughter Morgan's room. After puking my guts out in the bathroom across the hall, I climbed in between the pink frilly sheets of Morgan's bed. Morgan was a fair bit younger than me, and had opted out of the party by taking a trip across country to visit her biological father. Because of her young age, Morgan enjoyed things such as the color pink, makeup, and dolls. I closed my eyes tightly in order to block out the vacant stares of the dolls posed along her bookshelf. I rolled over to face the wall and quickly fell asleep. I woke sometime later to a soft light creeping into the room. With my back to the door, I assumed my mother or father was just checking in on me, so I closed my eyes again. Moments later, I heard the door creak closed. However, I noticed a shadow breathing in the room with me. I held my own breath and listened. The breathing was rough and obviously masculine. If it was my father or even Mr. Dale, why was he just standing by the door in the dark? Breaking the quiet rhythm of breathing, I heard the man as he shuffled towards the edge of the bed. I could now smell the smoke and booze that clung to him. He was so close that I felt the hairs on the back of my neck react to his proximity. Then he reached down and petted my hair. Frozen in sheer terror, I gasped and flung my eyes open. He chuckled and slid between the sheets lying next to me, continuing to pet my hair. I wanted to scream loudly, but I couldn't even utter a whimper. The man buried his nose into the nape of my neck. "You're so pretty, sweetheart," he cooed into my ear. I didn't recognize his voice, and knew that this must be Tom. He then pressed his body against the full length of my own and whispered, "You look just like your mom used to." I was so repulsed that I gagged violently. Fortunately, my stomach was empty. He responded by making soft hushing sounds, all while letting his filthy hands wander over me. I began to cry quietly. My tears only seemed to encourage Tom as he continued to molest me, by pulling down the waistband of my jeans and shoving his hand into my underwear. I'll spare most of the graphic details, but Tom violated me that night in Morgan's bed. He only relented when the back door of the house opened and shut. He paused, listening. Then Tom leaped out of the bed, pulled up his pants, and cracked the bedroom door. After surveilling the hallway, he slipped out, and I was alone again. I lay there in the dark in shock until my mother came to pick me up. I drove my parents home. That was it. I never told anyone, and I never encountered Tom again. I never asked about who he was or how he knew my mother. Honestly, I just wanted the whole night to be forgotten. If it wasn't for that random drunken partier who spooked Tom away, God only knows what else he would have done. I now stick very close by my parents during such gatherings, and pray to never see that bastard again. Three. The story I'm going to talk about is 100% true. When I was younger, I would see a black figure. The figure had no features. The only thing I could make out was that it was a man, It was never scary back then. It would never be up close to me, so it wouldn't freak me out. I never told anyone about him because I was only 6 or 7 years old and thought nothing about it. This information is going to relate further along in the story. I was sat at my Nana's living room watching television, and in the corner of my eye I saw something looking through the window. I looked out the window and there it was. This was the first time I saw the figure. As soon as it saw me turn my head, it turned right. I went to the door and there was nothing outside. This did confuse me as the garden was shared by the 5 houses on my Nana's road, as it was on a main street, and turning right would lead to a dead end of the garden with a wooden fence, about 12 feet. I would show you a picture of the garden, but my Nana passed away and I don't visit her old home. The last time I saw this figure was when I was walking to my dad's friend's house. I was walking up the left side of the hill. About halfway up, I saw it. Walking down the right side of the road. This made me feel an edge, but it never scared me. My dad could see I was on edge, but never mentioned me about it, only asking if I was okay. Skip forward about 6 years, I became best friends with a girl called Amy. She was 3 years older than me, and was mature for her age. That's how I knew what happened was not just some joke she was playing. I slept at Amy's house every week, Friday to Sunday, and sometimes during the week. One Saturday I slept over, and we went to bed as normal. That morning I woke up tired, like I had a really unsettled sleep. Sometime after I had woke up, Amy woke up and she looked over at me and her face sunk. The things she said after still gives me chills all over my body now, and it's been 2 years. Chloe, last night I woke up, and when I looked over at you there was a black figure strangling you in your sleep. She couldn't have known that. I never told anyone about the figure. This horrified me and had been the only time I had been scared by the figure because he has been close to me and had physically touched me, and the fact that he was trying to kill me shook me to the core. I'm now 15, turning 16 in March, and I've not had another experience with the figure until recently. My brother is 7 and is called Riley. The other day he came into my room at 2:40 in the morning, complaining that there was a black figure at the end of his bed. I hope and pray that he doesn't have to go through what I did. Four. I had sleep paralysis since I could remember, but I never really knew what it was. For me it happened as I fell asleep, tunnel vision, can't move, general feeling of fear, someone in the room I can't see. It would happen maybe twice, 3 times a month. It always terrified me. One day I was watching an alien show on TV with my parents, one of those UFO Files kind of shows. The episode was on an alien abduction. And as a child I thought, wow, I'm being abducted. I know, I told my parents this, but I don't recall any discussion. The episodes continued normally for a few years. I always questioned the alien abduction theory because even after hearing about it on TV, I never saw aliens or thought I was being taken by a UFO or was on a UFO. One day when I was around 14, I finally used the internet to look up what was happening to me. I learned so much that day. I learned of old hag syndrome, saw paintings from old times when witches sat on people's chests while they slept. I read accounts, I learned all the science I could understand. I was so proud of myself. I ended my revelations that day believing I for sure had sleep paralysis. And what's more, I thought that sleep paralysis must be what all this alien abduction stories were about. It didn't seem far-fetched at all. When my parents got home, I told them about it, and they said, "Oh, great, good for you." That night I went to bed with much less fear than I ever had before, then proceeded to have the most active dream experiences I ever had, barring another time later. As I fell asleep, I started to feel an episode coming, which surprised me. I let it happen, and it started out normal. After maybe 20 seconds, it's so hard to tell. I started seeing very alien silhouettes forming around my bed, equidistant from each other and tall. Thin necks, huge heads, just outlines. As I began quietly panicking, the shapes began to meld into each other, forming a black sphere. Just as the sphere closed, I snapped out of the episode. I lay in bed, on my back, staring at the ceiling, breathing hard. I had enough time to think to myself, my God, and roll over onto my side, staring down the hallway to the rest of my house. In the hallway stood a hulking, monstrous figure, dragging a part of itself, and already moving down the hall to my room. I screamed and woke up, for real sitting up in my bed and staring down the hall. A woman's voice then said clearly, "You're awake." It startled me because I'd already woken up. No one was in the room, the voice seemed to have no origin. I did not sleep the rest of the night. I went and played GameCube and thought. For years, nothing like that happened again. The episodes were decreasing and were less scary, but still happening every now and then. I met a girl, and she one time watched as I had an episode. It was unique because she grabbed my head and turned it sideways as it was happening, which I'd never experienced. Her face appeared to start peeling away with bugs underneath. It was pretty unsettling. We both agreed to just let the episodes play out after that. Note, obviously I knew that these things happening were segments of dreams and that I was experiencing them while half awake because of how that works. The alien episode had been eye-opening. It cemented my belief that most abduction stories are sleep paralysis related. It helped me understand how powerful the brain is, how confusing things can seem. I fully understood how a person could have an experience 10 times as powerful to the point of religious. Sleep paralysis can be a real son of a bitch sometimes. Around 22, the episodes were down to about 5 or 6 times a year. One night I went to my parents' house to visit, found that we had family in town and stayed the night. I slept in my brother's room alone, with the door closed. That night I had an incredible dream. One of those once-in-a-lifetime dreams where everything is abnormally vivid, and the subject matter totally fresh, almost like you're dreaming a new movie. Not sure how else to say it. In the dream, I was a 1950s Hollywood cowboy. I was shooting a whole bunch of bad guys, just really kicking ass in a John Wayne way. Everything was brightly colored. Near the end of the dream, I tried to climb up on a shed so I could get a good vantage of the shootout. As I lifted myself up over the edge of the roof, a bad guy I hadn't seen turned and emptied his revolver into my face. I fell off the roof and laid on the dirt on my back in complete agony. Some of my fingers were blown off. I had the distinct feeling my own finger bones were dug like debris into my face. I had a red filter over one eye. It was awful. I had never died in a dream, still haven't. Usually you fall, wake up before you hit, or you get stabbed, wake up holding yourself. It's usually very tidy from my experience. Not this time. I laid in the dirt, hurting and dying for what felt like 45 minutes. I remember hearing gunshots, big intervals of men yelling or silence in between. My eyes were too jacked to see anything but blurry trees. The shed, if I tried. It was just grisly. It lasted so long. I woke up, very relaxed on my back. The woman's voice said, "You're dead," just as my eyes opened. I waited for other sounds, voices, but the house was quiet. No one was in the room. No one was even awake when I left the room, then the house. Overall, not sleep paralysis, and not as terrifying as the alien episode. But I'd heard that woman's voice twice now, both times seemingly when I was awake. It had to be sleep paralysis related. Just some small thing that can happen I'd not read about. Like I say, the brain is strong, does weird things, but you can be sure I remembered the voice. I thought about it a lot over the next few months. Then things got very complicated. By 25, the episodes were over. A year passing without a single one. Something very serious and with potentially life-changing repercussions happened. My wife had a child, and something caused me to not be able to sleep in the same house with the baby for a month. It was nothing sinister, but very personal, and I'd rather not go into it. Suffice it to say that I had to sleep in my car for a month, visit my family in the day. Not doing so could result in me and my wife losing the baby. You're smart people, you can figure it out. So I slept in my car, that is to say, I mostly waited for the sun to come up. Then I went home. But some nights I'd be too exhausted, and I'd drift off in unnatural and uncomfortable positions, and slowly the sleep paralysis returned. It was a new experience to have sleep paralysis sitting in a car, staring at a street by night. But other than the exotic locale, I was essentially over this now. Sleep paralysis held no allure to me anymore. It was no longer fascinating, scary, a story to be told. It was just annoying. Super. Roll my eyes while I'm paralyzed annoying. Come on, I think while frozen, seeing shadows move in the street. Do what you're gonna do, then knock it off, I'm tired. Of these car events, nothing crazy ever came. I never saw figures, dreamed a car wreck, imagined I was being stalked just outside the vehicle. That at least would have been interesting. Eventually something very fortunate happened. A bunch of people were fired, and my family's nonsense ended. I went home and spent the first night with my family. It was amazing. I slept like a rock. The next day was nice. My wife and I took turns with the baby. We were both still exhausted from the whole ordeal, but we were glad we were together. At some point, the baby fell asleep. I found myself laying alone in the guest room of our house thinking. It was the middle of the day, and sunlight was flooding the room. I was happier than I had been in a very long time. So as I felt sleep paralysis coming on, I thought to myself, strange, but okay, hurry up. The purpose of this story is to inform. If you have sleep paralysis, very strange and seemingly real things can happen to you. I need to explain this episode in extreme detail to help you understand, help you see what's possible with this. The bed was very old, a thick, overstuffed single mattress. Anything happening on the bed is felt everywhere else. Someone sits down, you hear the springs, you feel the bed shift. I was frozen on my back, in a fully sunlit room, a first. I was not nervous or panicked. In fact, I didn't even have tunnel vision, another first. No blood-rushing sound to my ears. A couple seconds passed like this. It was almost pleasant, except for the paralyzed part. And then someone sunk one of their knees into the mattress on my left side, then another on my right, like I was being straddled. I felt the bed sink, heard the springs groan. The same thing happened on either side of my head. One then the other, like two hands pressing into the mattress. This time I can see the bed depressing by my shoulders. Someone is right on top of me. But I could breathe fine. There was no fear, I could hear. I laid that way, just staring up at nothing. My back arched a little from the other person's weight on the end. A few seconds passed before I said as politely but directly as I could, putting a whole bunch of intent behind the words. Please get the fuck off of me. To my surprise, I actually spoke these words. I was even able to turn my head in disgust, like when someone steps too far into your face. It was a lot to accomplish while incapacitated that way. I'd never had that mobility during an episode. Maybe another 2 seconds of silence passed before I felt the hands lift up. I watched the bed near my shoulders return to normal. The thing waited like it was thinking. Then the knees lifted up. Left, then right. Right side of the bed getting very heavy with the shifting weight. It was off of me, but right before I came out of the episode, I heard the exact same woman's voice say, "Fine." And I never had sleep paralysis again. Been 2.5 years now. So, clearly I have thoughts on all of this. I do not believe in the paranormal. If anything, this has shown me stronger evidence for why some things are unexplained. The brain is unbelievable. However, I can't help but get caught up on the timing of the first episode, coinciding with my insight and discovery of sleep paralysis, or the fact that the woman's voice spoke to me 3 times over the span of a decade. Facts about the voice. It was always the same, young woman, digital sounds coming over a loudspeaker. It immediately reminded me of the voice of the woman from the Purge trailer. Very authoritative, but possibly dangerous, possibly acting towards some dystopian agenda. I've always wondered if the paranormal were real or if other stranger things could happen. If I really did will my sleep paralysis away, giving it a face, treating it like a thinking, motivated entity. It's fun to think that I ended up reasoning with it, found some middle ground. The terrifying thing is that in the 2 years since these events, I've noticed things with my daughter. Things my wife doesn't seem to take seriously. She cries in her sleep, opens her eyes and stares sometimes in her sleep. Part of me worries that I didn't send my sleep paralysis monster away, only unwittingly made a deal with it. If that's the case, I'm confident I can steer her through it. Fuck you, sleep paralysis. With all due respect, of course. 5. I've always wondered about my family's background on both my paternal and maternal sides. Not only because, obviously, I want to learn about my family, but that my dad's last name, and of course also my surname, is unique and one of a kind. This meaning if anyone else, not only in America, but in the world has my last name, I'm 100% related to them. My dad is the second to youngest of 6 children, so he does have documents and photo albums of my ancestors. Even the first dating back to the 1800s from his dad's side, my grandpa, that migrated from Germany, and his mother's side, my grandma, that migrated from Great Britain. The people that were there before the Roman conquest, the British Isles, Spain, and Portugal. My dad doesn't have all the info since my other uncles and aunts have the others, and they live all over the country, so it isn't easy to find out everything. And nearly impossible to find everything on Ancestry.com since my last name is not only one of a kind, but was also slightly changed to sound more American when they migrated. There are many fascinating stories about my dad's side, but not nearly as gnarly as my mom's. My mother's side, who is an only child, has just about every document you could have. Well, at least my only living grandparent still has. I've always regretted never really sitting down and asking questions and hearing more stories from my other 3 grandparents who have since passed. But I still have that opportunity with my grandpa. His wife and my grandma passed away 2 years ago, and he has been completely heartbroken ever since. So whenever we get the chance to sit down and talk about the history of the family, he enjoys talking about his and of what he knows of hers. Well, I can tell you my mom's side is so fucking interesting and completely full of criminals. I guess things haven't changed. Wait, forget you heard that. On my grandma's Irish side, many of my ancestors did a lot of time in prison. What's so crazy is a great female ancestor of mine did 7 years for only freaking pickpocketing. I could talk all day about my ancestors, like ones who were involved in the Black Hand Society, which is an American-Italian extortion racket with the mafia. No, I'm not Italian, and my ancestor wasn't in the mafia, but he worked for them as a card shark and hustler. Or that other one of my ancestors was a personal guard for Abraham Lincoln, with a picture to go along with it. There are even crazier stories associated with that, but maybe for another time. My grandpa's side of the family mostly comes from the United Kingdom and France. Sorry to get off topic real quick, but my grandpa knows I'm writing this story for you all to hear, and he wants to make it abundantly clear that there is zero history of anyone in our family ever being involved in slavery or racism. My grandparents were both hugely involved in the civil rights movement, invested in the 1968 Fair Housing Act, and my grandmother marched for women now. My grandma would have been proud to be a part of our recent Women's March in America. And my mother even remembers being at Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech when she was just a tyke. He just wanted people to know that. He's a proud man of himself and his wife. We all are. What I found to be the most interesting person in my family was my grandfather's grandfather, whose name really is Thomas or Tom, that I won't hide. However, if you look at our family tree, you notice something doesn't match up quite right. And that is the fact that the last name of my great-great-grandfather completely comes out of nowhere. No ancestor before him had this last name, and it only started with him. I found this to maybe be a flaw in the documents, and had asked my grandpa what that was about. He smiled because he knows what he's about to tell me will be something I find fascinating. He isn't so proud of it, but he knows that I am interested in the history of crime, murder, horror, and all that jazz. He asks me to grab a box out of his basement. It takes me a while to find it, but I eventually do. The box is extremely dusty. When I brought it up, he said that it hadn't been opened in years, even before my mother's birth in 1956. He took out a picture that was taken in 1901 to be exact. The photo was of a young couple. My grandpa said that this is his grandfather Thomas and grandmother Nellie. They were both recently married when this photo was taken. They both had the typical and serious still-look faces they would have in portraits during these times. Nellie had curly hair and Tom had a very stern and tough look, and slick-backed hair with a slight cowlick. If I can best describe how he looks, look up a picture of the notorious bank robber Jesse James, specifically the photo one on his Wikipedia page. During this photo, they were both 19 years old and living in Silsbee, Texas. My grandpa explained to me that this was the man with a different last name. My grandpa explains that Tom was a rough-around-the-edges type man. He was constantly getting into barroom brawls. He accumulated many facial scars through his lifetime from these fights, such as glass being shattered on his face, or from a slight shiv from a knife. Okay, this is where the story gets interesting. Apparently, during the summer of 1903, my great-grandpa Tom and 2 other men got into a fight with 4 other men at a bar. Nothing new to Tom, but this time the fight went too far. One of the men Tom was fighting was stabbed and murdered. They all 3 fled the scene. One of the men was caught 2 days later, sentenced to death and hung. The other man later turned himself in and was sentenced to life in prison. However, there is talk he was released after 20 years, but there is no proof. My great-great-grandpa, like the sly guy he was, got his wife Nellie, went on the run and escaped to New Orleans, Louisiana, where they resided the rest of their lives. This is where Tom changed his entire identity. His first name was always the same, but his middle name and last name were different. This last name was already a pretty common last name, so there wouldn't be too much suspicion, but this is where a new lineage started. I found this amazing. I asked my grandpa how this was even possible to get away with. He simply said it was the early 1900s. You just could. Turned out my great-great-grandmother Nellie lived to be 100 years old. Tom lived to be in his early 50s and died from heart failure. But he apparently lived a pretty successful life. There are dozens upon dozens of letters his son, Tom Jr., wrote about his father, and how he always had that tough son-of-a-bitch attitude the rest of his life, but never got into anything serious like that again. The one thing we'll never know, because it isn't written down, and my grandfather never actually got to know his grandfather, is if Tom was the one who killed the man in the bar. It could have been any one of the other 2 men. What mattered is he was involved, and knew he had to book it. I just find this story fascinating, not only because it's my family, but that a man could kill another man, change states, change his identity, and live the rest of his life without a problem. Can't do that today. I look at this now framed picture of them today and just think, he never would have known that 2 years after the time this photo was taken, his entire life would have to change. Rest in peace to the man he may have murdered, but also rest in peace to great-great-grandpa Tom. Hey everyone, Hellfreezer here, and thank you very much for listening to 5 True Scary Subscriber Stories, episode 34. Thank you very much to everyone who allowed me to use their stories in this video. If you yourself have a story you would like me to read, then you can send it to kingofthecities at googlemail or gmail.com. Both will get to me. Links in the description below, and it should be on the screen right now as you're listening to this, assuming I've actually typed it properly. Okay, I'm going to have to cut the outro a bit short this week because I'm in a bit of a rush. to get my next video done, so I can have tomorrow off, because I'm planning on getting up early tomorrow, which means I'll have a sleepy day ahead of me because my sleeping schedule is completely messed up. Going to bed too late, getting up too late, it's just no good. So I'm going to have to try and fix that. And with that, I'm going to head off for now. So until next time, thank you very much for listening, and take very good care of yourselves.